Good to see you all. This is the last lecture that will deal with the microeconomics of European integration, and it's kind of an important summary of a lot of things we've talked about until now. And I'll give you the chance to ask questions if you want, because as of next week, we'll start talking about the macroeconomics of European integration. We'll talk about the idea of a common currency, and the predecessor of that was the floating exchange rate system with some pegging, and further backwards we started with the gold standard. So Europe was basically dealing with itself using gold as money, and that's an interesting starting point for us. So we'll begin with that next week. Before we go into that subject, we'll review some of the principles of macroeconomics. So we'll just be a review lecture. So I need to get warmed up. We've been doing a lot of microeconomics. Now we'll do some macroeconomics next week. Okay, so today we want to talk about the last dimension of European integration. I want to make it clear to you that we've talked about trade in the past few lectures, and you've dealt with this topic with Berfin. This course is a bit unusual in the fact that it tries to get at European integration from the factor market side as well as the trade and goods side. So it's not just about trading goods with other countries and regions. It's also about people moving and capital moving. And that's important to remember as we move to the end of this segment of the course. So I'll review these, the role of trade and how it usually works to bring European regions in some sort of harmony with each other in terms of factor prices, possibly avoiding the need for lots of mobility. But sometimes it doesn't work, and that's the failure of economic integration. And we'll talk a little bit in detail about total factor productivity, which is not just technology. It's about the level of the production function in a region compared to another. And sometimes, for reasons that have little to do with technology, it may be the case that some regions are just more productive than others. They have better infrastructure. We learned that in the growth segment. They may have better educated workers. They may have a government that works. The absence of bribe taking and corruption is also important. That tends to scare away economic activity. If someone starts a business and then someone comes and asks for a handout or tries to strong-arm the business, that kind of deters people's desires to start businesses. So all these things matter as well. And that could be one of the largest problems in Europe, and that's the reason we have the European Social Charter and the chapters that European countries are required to fulfill before they can actually be a candidate to join. And this may lead to some sort of structural problems within the country. So you can have structural change even in advance before the European Union becomes enlarged. You can have adjustment processes that cause unemployment and discontent. So the end of this lecture is about trying to motivate why there's a lot of discontent with the European integration process. And we'll talk about other types of trade. We've talked about mostly hexro-lean trade. That's the factor proportions idea. Countries with capital rich endowments will tend to trade and produce and export goods that are capital intensive, and vice versa for countries with labor abundance, but there are other ways of thinking about trade, and the last one I'd like to talk about is called intra-industry trade. It's when you trade in goods both ways in the same type of product. So Germany exports beer to France, that's kind of clear, but France also exports beer to Germany. And the only reason I can see that these products are different is they have different labels on them, they have different reputations, people have affinity for certain colors of tennis shoes and others maybe not so much. And this type of preference for variety can also lead to trade. Okay, and that's something we have to deal with because about half of the trade we observe is really intra-industry in nature. Okay, so again, we'll come back to that. And then we'll finish talking about this notion of what TFP is, again, an open question. Germany and France are very similar now. If you look at productivity data for hours worked in an industry, in the same industry, they're almost identical. So Germany and France are they've almost become a single, economic unit. There's very little difference across. Maybe the French use a little bit more nuclear energy and the Germans are into wind, but in terms of the GDP per capita and wages per hour for skilled workers, they're very, very similar, and they have similar tax systems. There's a lot of similarities. So that's kind of the end point of integration. And then you look to the east and you see countries like Poland and Romania. Things are still at the beginning of this process. And the question is whether they'll converge or not has also to do with whether we can raise the total factor productivity in the broad sense in those places like Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, to the Western European level. That's the final step in the integration process. I'll review quickly what we did last time. We talked about Rybczynski, we talked about factor price equalization. Rybczynski is quantities, factor price equalization is about prices, obviously, and factor prices. And we talked about the way you can apply Hexroline creatively to think about European integration. There are a lot of reasons why this doesn't work. Okay, so that's important to talk about. So in my view, Hexroline trade theory can explain trade integration between Germany and Poland quite well, or Finland and Poland. But if you look at a country like Albania or Bosnia, there's just not enough capital there. The production function may look very different. There are all sorts of reasons why this may not work. And if it doesn't work, you're going to have pressure to migrate. And that pressure to migrate leads to other issues in Europe. It's causing them right now. We know about the political discussion. How many migrants, how many refugees can Germany take and continue to function and pay for it? So these are all the things that have led to political resistance. I talked about that last time, and we'll go into detail again. Let's remind ourselves, what are the mechanisms? These are the things that you want to know for the exam, the four engines, the four motors of integration. Again, we're making a lot of assumptions to make this work, but the idea is simply you don't have to move the factors to get wages and rates of return on capital to converge, and you can achieve the efficient, remember the efficiency definition of integration, allocation of production patterns without moving a single unit of capital or moving a single worker. And that's kind of what we've spent the last two weeks talking about. The failure of this to happen, and these are small regions trading in the world economy taking prices as given. So this is an easy version of trade for you guys. We don't force balanced trade between Germany and Poland, right? It's just the German and the Polish firms and are taking prices on the world markets as given and producing efficiently to do so. You can still have failures. Okay, we can have failure of trade integration. We can also have factor mobility may also not work, and that would be in the case of putting up borders and preventing people from moving or investment from occurring. Not the case in European integration, and we can also have different levels of total factor productivity. Let's remind ourselves what we talked about last week about why trade integration may not work. One would be that, remember what this diagram is supposed to be about? It's supposed to be about sectoral mobility within a region, so workers can choose between the capital-intensive and the labor-intensive sectors, and as a result, there's a common wage and a common rate of return on capital in those two sectors, and that enforces, by the intersection of the two isocost curves, basically two different capital-labor ratios. And those capital-labor ratios can be projected back onto the Edgeworth box, and we can see that in this particular case, E is inside the parallelogram. So that means that E could be an achievable point where you could have factor price equalization, relative specialization, not complete specialization. So you can see already, looking at point E, it's not on the edge of the parallelogram, so the capital poor country will produce some capital intensive output, but it'll produce mostly labor intensive output. And vice versa for the capital intensive region, in this case, call it Finland, would produce mostly the capital-intensive output and a little bit of the labor-intensive output. Okay, and that, if you don't get that, please study the slides of the past couple of lectures, because that's kind of interesting to help us understand the rest of this mechanism. If you're at point E prime, this is not going to happen. Okay, so this is not a candidate for that type of integration. So you're going to have basically wages much lower in the labor-rich region, and the rate of return on capital will be low in the capital-rich region, and these factors will tend to move towards regions where the rate of return is higher. Okay, and we can also see that if you think about the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, a change in the price of goods on world markets can actually cause the shape of that parallelogram to change. So in other words, an adverse terms of trade movement, meaning one that affects negatively the price of one of the goods that uses one of the factors more intensively, will automatically change the angle of those two lines in the parallelogram. So here's a case of where the capital-intensive good becomes cheaper on world markets. The Stolper-Samuelson theorem explains that, the effects of that, by looking at an inward shift of the ISO cost curve. And you can see that both capital-labor ratios will increase in equilibrium. Okay? This causes the shape of that parallelogram, which was the sort of the shaded area, now it's the red rays, to be shaped differently. So E was in the region before. If you go back, if you look carefully, you can see that E is, it's kind of not, the shading is not so great, but if you get the slides on your computer, you can see it more clearly. That shift causes E to be outside the parallelogram, or the zone of incomplete specialization, so therefore we have a failure of trade integration. Okay, so then at that point, you can see those little green arrows basically point to the direction of factor mobility, which will kick in that moment when wages and factor capital returns are different. So capital will move to the capital poor region, and labor will move to the labor-rich region. Okay, and it can also happen that technical change causes the capital-labor ratios that are implied by factor price equalization to be more similar. So one of the neat things about this Heckscher-Ohlin trade integration is that, you know, the parallelogram is not trivial. It's not like a diagonal. It actually has, there are two different possible uses of capital and labor that have very different capital intensities. There's no reason that has to be true. It might be the case that capital-labor ratios in both sectors are very similar, and therefore we're talking about the old-fashioned moving to the diagonal idea that we had at the very beginning of the course. Okay, so you can think about you know, this parallelogram getting thinner and thinner and less likely to encompass the endowment point, and then you have a failure of trade integration. We talked about non-traded goods, so this is in this model, and remember, models are supposed to help us think abstractly. The reason we do economics is to help us think outside the box, right? But the world is so complex that sometimes we really need, maybe someday we won't have to, just ask ChatGPT, but in the meantime, we really have to think, and one way of thinking is just to say, okay, let's suppose there are just two types of goods, one's more and one's less capital intensive, and now we're going to say, okay, what if there really aren't just two types of goods? There's a third good that is not traded, okay, and we need it in the sense that we need to get a haircut, we need to get a taxi, we need to get public transport, we need to pay for people to clean this building, and those are not tradable. Okay, so that means that those factors that are used for that output are not available for international trade. So the effect of that is to shrink the relevant Edgeworth box for trade integration. Okay, and if that's the case, you can see that it's obvious that a lot more points of endowment, like F and E, are no longer in the parallelogram of incomplete specialization in this new setup. Okay? Again, this is a bachelor course. We're not going to prove this mathematically, but it's really easy to establish the general conditions you need for that to happen. All you need is use your head. Obviously, we go to restaurants, you know, we go to clubs. These are non-traded goods. And as long as people and capital are used in those activities, it's not going to be available for the achievement of trade, Hexro-lean type of trade integration. I also talked about wage rigidities. I'll go very quickly through this. The idea was simply that if you're talking about world prices that are affected by what's going on in the region, so now we move from Germany, Poland, or Finland, Poland, to a situation EU versus the US. So policies in the EU and the US can actually affect world prices. Then this would actually have a feedback, and the idea was simply use your head and think about capital as being human capital, think about simple labor as being labor. You can use the same theorem again to say that a price a price decrease or an increase will affect directly in the same direction the factor that is used more intensively in the production of that particular good. So in the case of European minimum wages, for example, the idea was Europe is a big place. Now we're talking about like 400 million, 500 million, depending on your perspective. If all those countries impose a minimum wage, that's going to raise the price of low skill intensive output. That's going to raise the price on world markets. And this will affect the United States as well. If the United States doesn't have those wage rigidities that we talked about, that would lead to sort of almost like a boomerang. The U.S. would actually export its unemployment, wouldn't have any, to Europe, and Europe would have the burden of having a lot of low-skilled unemployment. So again, an old model that makes that clear. Okay, so that's an idea that one has to be aware of. Now, the U.S. has minimum wages too, but they're just a lot lower. So again, we've always thought about market clearing. There's no unemployment in the benchmark model, but as soon as you start thinking about unemployment, you might want to get a little bit nervous. All these things are going to come back to haunt us when we talk about European integration. Okay, so that's just a review of what we did then. So if you really insist on using the paradigm sort of this Hexro-lean trade, it's like basically moving the relevant parallelogram into the light blue, which would create some unemployment in the European Union. A lot of people thought this was a great characterization of what happened in Europe in the past 25 years. After unification, for example, there was a lot of unemployment in Germany, a lot of unemployment in France. Things have gotten better, of course, over time. We've got demographics kicking in, and there's a lot less of this, but it's an interesting perspective. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, a long review, sorry, but it's worth it. It's worth it. And now I'd like to talk about globalization again. And we talked about this picture with the and the notion of what's the sense of trade. International trade is supposed to make us better off. We've noticed a big decline in costs of moving goods back and forth, coordination costs have gone down because of the internet. We don't use telex, we don't use fax anymore. We use internet. We use all sorts of. We use the blockchain to do trade. So this has made it a lot cheaper to trade. So the cost of trade has gone down, which means, of course, that a lot of goods that weren't traded before are now becoming tradable. And it also means that sectoral mobility for those sectors that are supposed to shrink versus those that are supposed to grow will increase, and then people will have to become unemployed. We'll have to change sectors. Or maybe young people who would normally go into sector A would go into sector B. So this type of sectoral mobility we've assumed from the very beginning. The intersection of the ISO cost curves is nothing but an assumption of factor mobility. Because if the wage is higher in the one sector, people will go there, and in the equilibrium, sectoral wages and rates of return on capital are the same. But if that doesn't happen instantly, you're going to have some unemployment. Okay, so think about it. Think about Germany after reunification, how much unemployment there was in East Germany and how much overemployment there was in West Germany. Okay, and after 20 years, we've seemed to solve that problem. For 30 years, we've solved that problem. But it means that in the moment where you have unemployment, you're going to have some unpopularity of trade. And shrinking sectors, and we can think about the Lausitz right now in eastern Germany. So one of the best paying sectors in the new German states was the coal industry. So now all of a sudden we're coming along and saying, no, we're not going to do this anymore. You're creating a lot of discomfort. So the point of showing this picture before was to say, okay, now we've got this situation where declining transport costs, container shipping, international courier services, the internet, all this has made trade very cheap. And people who just love the idea of free trade would say, well, let's specialize completely. Let's just make only cars in Germany and export them all over the world. Okay, so this is the limit case of a world where we had Ricardian trade, not Hexro-lean trade. That doesn't make any sense, but and if you look at the data, it's clear, and Germany is really the poster child of a globalizing country. For its size, for 82 million people, 84 million, however many you want to count, it is incredibly open. At the middle of Europe, that's like the footmat of Europe, and if you look at this, C plus I plus G plus X minus Z equals GDP, right? So you can look at the shares. I mean, if you add those curves together, you get GDP. And you have to net out imports. Okay, so you don't have to have much of an imagination to see that Germany has grown over the past 30 years. Consumption has grown, okay, but not as fast as exports, not as fast as imports. So Germany is moving in the direction of integration. Most of this is within Europe, but also with China, with the United States, et cetera. So just to give you an idea, the big movements of those curves, the big curves of movement are X and Z. And these are gross numbers. Okay, so Germany is exporting a lot, Export Weltmeister. Now it's number 2, but China's a really big country. And Germany's 80. So the Germans are real proud of that, but they're also Import Weltmeister, right? So a lot of the Z is intermediate inputs that we put into stuff that gets exported again. That's part of this game. And that's part of the shrimp I showed you last time. Remember I showed you the women peeling the shrimp in Morocco? It's the same kind of thing. I mean, how much of that is actually welfare improving? Does it have a carbon footprint? And how many jobs are being created, and how many jobs are being destroyed, and what's the path? So I'll talk about that because I think one of the most important factors that will conclude this part of the course is how much trade integration and how much factor market integration can Europeans take? There's probably some limit to what can be born. I mean, economists often say, okay, let's just maximize efficiency. Let's just make all the cars here, But that's probably not going to work for various reasons. And one of the reasons is that Europe has chosen a way, so-called social market economy, to make it more livable to live in a market economy. The fact that you're changing jobs, changing sectors, mobility is important, means that the government is going to step in and support you because there's no private market institution that will insure you against the losses that you could face if your industry collapses, right? That's the idea behind a social market economy, soziale Marktwirtschaft, because mobility is it goes part and parcel with globalization. It's part of the story. And I'm mostly talking about intersectoral, okay, but even within a sector, getting retrained to do more complicated tasks means you may be out of work for a while, or maybe you have to go take a course or something. Okay, all these things are part of what we call mobility. And mobility is painful. So 1/2 of all East German workers in the first decade after unification had to change in some way, change their job, change their occupation, and that was painful, right? So social policies, and that's part of the European Charter, is to cushion that, to make it easier to accept those changes. You don't have this in the United States. Now, the United States gets along pretty well without it, but that's the American way, and if you don't have to claim that one system is better or worse than the other. You can certainly claim that the systems have an effect on the way people behave and the way people deal with change, right? So can I count on the government helping me if I lose my job, and to what extent? So Americans have social insurance, but it's a lot leaner than it is in Europe. Okay, so you have unemployment benefits. If you lose your job, it's like an insurance, but some people think of it as a piggy bank. You know, I've paid into the system. I have the right to be unemployed for 6 months or for a year. Okay, it's not the case in the United States. You have people who cannot get a job for whatever reasons can get help from the government. People consider their job a property right. If you've worked for an employer long enough, it's your job, and therefore the employer cannot just fire you. That's not the case in the United States. It's also not the case in Denmark, okay? But it's the case in Germany and France, in Italy. It's kind of a tradition that, well, the workers brought in something into the pot, and this is an asset that the worker also owns to some extent, and employment protection, Sozialversicherung, Kündigungsschutz is kind of an effort to protect that. That's what it's called. But you can't make job protection absolute because you'll never have structural change if you do that, right? So you have this incredible tension. So there are ways to close a company if you have to. It makes it hard to be an entrepreneur in Germany, but if you have to, you can close a company. You have to pay your workers an Abfindung, you know, like some sort of a payout or a severance pay, and some of this is actually regulated at the European level. So you can have actually some condition of getting some severance pay if you've worked long enough for your employer. Okay, this is something you could also bargain with your employer. A lot of people of the more liberal tradition say, "Why don't you just cut a deal with your boss?" It's hard. If you're a single guy and you're working in a company with 1,000 workers, your boss is going to cut a special deal with you. You need to organize, okay? So I'm not pleading for unions, but that's the reason unions exist, because workers are always at a disadvantage with respect to the employer. That's the way I feel with the Humboldt University. Right? So in a year they're going to kick me out, right? So I'm trying very hard to fight back, but I don't have a union. All I can do is maybe go on strike. No one will notice. Right? So that's the idea. This is a European tradition. I mean, the trade unions came from Europe, even though the Americans, the U.S. Americans had their heyday when unions were actually quite strong. But this is a European tradition. So we have collective bargaining institutions, right? We have the government gives the workers a right to not be fired if they try to organize, and at least try to talk to the boss and say, look, you've paid us badly. We know that these other companies are paying more. We're more productive. We see your profits. You know, again, this is not neoclassical economics. This is trying to look through cut through the reality and get to neoclassical economics, because we know that in the end productivity does matter. It's the reason you get paid. So workers have to respect that. You can't just go on strike because you want more money, because we all want more money. And the government also imposes a minimum wage. Okay, minimum wage is an interference in the market, and there must be some reason for that. So one reason might be that employers have too much power, right? That's one option. Another might be you feel sorry for the workers who don't have much productivity, but that's not efficient. That's not the efficient way to do it. You probably just want to give workers money in that case. But if you think employers have some market power that you want to counteract, then you might want to think about the minimum wage. So these are all things that Europe has thought about a long time, and this is fine print, but this is the kind of stuff that countries have to deal with if they want to join the EU, because the idea behind the EU is a level playing field, because globalization or trade integration, factor market integration will cause dislocation, okay? And these, when you're home in your apartment tonight, just read through what's in the European social chapter. Okay, there's a lot of detail in there. So you have the access to this right. Okay, whether the countries actually give you the right, fulfill it, is another question. But it's also true that for me, the hard-nosed economist, we know that these measures have an effect on labor markets. Okay, we know that I just showed you the Davis paper high minimum wage in Europe will cause unemployment in Europe. And it will be magnified by trade with the United States, okay? But, don't listen to me, look at the data. The data show that anytime a country applies to join the EU, or actually joins the EU, unemployment rises. Okay, so this is just this is like the Burns-Mitchell diagram from macro. Remember that? You have a peak of the business cycle, what happened before, what happened after. This is what happens before and what happens after you join or apply. Okay? Here we've got application to entry. So why would that be the case? Why would application start having a negative effect on unemployment? What do you think? Just applying. I mean, if you apply, that means you have to have a good shot at getting in, and then it takes a few years for the European Commission to figure out whether you're a viable candidate. We have to start reforming your labor markets to make them look like European EU labor markets. You have to adopt those elements of the social chapter. So the discomfort starts already when you apply. By the time you join, you should be ready for joining. So that the time between joining and applying is about 5 years. Okay, so this is based on the history up until Eastern European accession. So it doesn't even include Eastern European accession. This is no exception. So you can see that when it's about accession, unemployment has already risen. It's already started rising 5 years in advance. So when Poland tried to get fit for the EU, they had to do the things that the European Union demands. A lot of people resent that because it made them already unemployed before they joined the EU. Unemployment started rising in Polish industry because a lot of their industry was not competitive, right? The Polish watch industry. So in the communist times, there was a serious watch industry in Poland, making, Armbanduhren, okay? It's gone. It's completely gone, like a lot of other industries in Poland. But for that, in return, the Poles have expanding furniture industry, steel, chemicals, whatever, all the things we talked about before. Okay, so it turns out this is a fairly regular thing. You can correct it for the business cycle, et cetera. It still shows up. So there is this discomfort, not just of joining, but getting ready to join, getting your economy ready. So not surprising, a lot of countries are not so happy about being a member of the EU. Okay, so I'm going to show you some really interesting statistics. This is the Eurobarometer, which is a survey of Europeans. Europe is a huge place. I mean, it's not a country yet, but if it does become one, it will be bigger than the United States in terms of population, obviously, right? 400 million plus. So this is basically 2007. I'm going to give you the timeline. This is 2007. Each one of those bars is a country, and if you take the slides home tonight and look at them, you'll see which ones they are. The question is in German, which of the following statements reflects accurately your opinion about globalization? Okay, and the blue bar is globalization offers a chance, thanks to the opening of markets, for my own country's enterprises, companies. Okay? The red bar is agreement with globalization means a threat for my employment and for our firms in my country. Okay? So who wants to guess, I don't know if you can see this, but which country is on the right, on the farthest right? You all know license plate identification. So right. And this is, I'll show you in the next 20 years, this hasn't changed, or 15 years, okay? Next to France is Cyprus and Greece. These are all countries that have had some issues in adapting to the opening. Even though France has done very well, we've seen the data, they haven't done as well as others. Go to the far left, Denmark, small open economy. The Danes are pretty cool about a lot of stuff, but they're also really cool about free trade. Okay, they see it as a chance, and it's a small country. We're talking 5 million people, right? They do have some issues with immigration, but in terms of trade, they're okay. And then we've got Sweden, Netherlands, Estonia, Slovakia, Poland, UK, so smaller countries. UK is open Britain, but open Britain eventually left, right? And you'll see that when you look at the next 7 years. Okay, this is the same question, more or less, but slightly different representation, because a lot of people didn't have an opinion, so you have to put those up as well. So you can see the identity of the countries hasn't changed much. The Scandinavian countries, the Baltic countries on the left, and on the right, you've got Greece, you've got France, Cyprus. Interestingly, the Czech Republic shows up. Someone will have to explain that to me. In the middle, you've got Germany. So Germany's kind of torn. You'd think Germany, open economy, globalized, Exportweltmeister, they would be really in favor of all this stuff. Ain't so. So people feel threatened. They feel like their companies are being threatened, their jobs being threatened. Okay, we can update it to 17, and of course things can change, like the financial crisis in Greece, which we'll talk about in the next few weeks, was a big negative for the Greeks, and they really, this is an outstanding example of how negative they were thinking about it. And Greece is not an open economy in comparison. If you take the fraction of exports plus imports divided by 2 of GDP and compare that with Denmark, it's like night and day. Is it because the Greeks were spoiled by tourism? They used to have an export industry in the 60s and 70s. So maybe the EU, joining the EU was part of that negative effect? I don't know. Anyway, the story goes on. So my research assistant actually got the most recent data. Nothing has changed. The rank correlation, the way people feel about Europe, and when I say globalization, I mean trade integration, factor market integration, with our neighbors, mostly Europe, but also China, Africa, United States. Over time, it's clear that Europe has understood it overall. This is the average, this is the EU bar over time. So every year you see the fraction of people who find globalization an opportunity for economic growth. They seem to be getting it because it's gone from 47% to 67%. But you still have this hardcore of people who just don't like it. And we see this in political debates now, even today in Germany, right? So this is the European reality. This integration has led to this picture, which is basically many countries think the EU is the greatest thing that ever happened. We've benefited from it. Interestingly, Poland is also very high, even though you hear this Eurosceptic noise. But then you look at France, only 63%. Germany's only 73%. That's just a snapshot from 2021. Okay, so, integration works. We've seen this, and I'm going to show you some really interesting data. Convergence has occurred within Europe. There's no question about it. There is no case of even in Greece, things have gotten better. Okay, of course, they've had some serious setbacks. But you have to pay the price. So let me just give you an example of how much structural change Germany has gone through in the past 30 years. Okay, so this is an example of the share of GDP in manufacturing. So Germany prides itself as being a manufacturing nation, always was. In the 1920s, Germany was exporting machine tools to the United States, and they still are, okay? But the fraction of workers and the fraction of GDP in manufacturing has shrunk a lot. And it's shrunk everywhere. Even Spain. I mean, Spain is a newcomer to the EU, built up a lot of auto manufacturing. Seat was taken over by Volkswagen, grew very fast. But overall, what's happening is we have growth in services. And I'm not just talking about tourism or cutting hair. I'm talking about business consulting. I'm talking about accounting services. I'm talking about restaurants, all the sectors that are labor intensive. Okay, and even within Germany after unification, you saw this. So this is an example of West Germany. So this is a study that I did looking at just West Germany after unification. So you see this slow structural change going on over the years before 1990, 1989. You can see that manufacturing is kind of, or production, manufacturing plus mining and energy is kind of slightly declining. There's a slight rise in construction, slight rise in services. And then after unification, things changed really dramatically because suddenly West Germany was competing with East Germany, competing with Eastern Europe. And you can see that the manufacturing shrank quite a bit. Those people are now working in other sectors or they've retired. And you can see this as a measure of entropy. So if you go across sectors, which sectors are growing, which sectors are shrinking, the real world is very chaotic. If you look at the micro, you see that some, right now the energy sector is booming if you're making heat pumps, and it's shrinking if you're making coal mining equipment. Both of those things are being made in Germany, right? So this measure of entropy also went up after unification. So sectors that were growing in absolute terms while others were falling, that measure of chaos was increasing. So German unification was not just an event for the East Germans, it was also an event for West German industry as well. So this is why Germany had a crisis. I don't know if you're maybe a bit too young to remember this, but the Hartz reforms were a response to exploding unemployment in West Germany and also in East Germany. The government kind of realized we cannot continue to pay for this. We have to generate enough value added to share it with the people who are less fortunate and can't get work. We have to make sure that the structural change occurs. So you can think of the Hartz reforms as being an effort. Chancellor Schröder at the time did this not because he's an evil man, but because he was advised by a lot of economists, says, look, if we keep going on this path, we'll end up in a very bad place. Okay? In the meantime, unemployment in Germany is so low, you have the fantastic opportunity. When you go on the job market, you can probably get 3 or 4 offers and decide. When I dealt with students 20, 30 years ago talking about this, I was saying, please apply to as many jobs as you can because it's really hard out there. It's a tough world. Okay, so things have changed a lot, and Germany has managed to deal with that crisis. So let's talk about, again, we're looking at convergence. This is a great way of doing this. If you write your bachelor thesis on some measure of convergence, you can do this very quickly. This is taking international price data, international constant dollars of 2011, and basically using the U.S. as a benchmark, not Germany, but the U.S. So you can see how Germany also kind of stumbles. This is 1995. This is during the exuberant years of post-unification. And you can see that what's happened in these intervening 10 years is that Bulgaria, Croatia, Czech Republic, Latvia, especially Poland, increased relative to Germany. Germany falls back because they're adjusting. All those unemployed people were not working in 2005. That's when the Hartz reforms were implemented. Okay? The world doesn't stand still. The UK was growing. Okay, this is 2010. So Germany's starting to move a bit closer to the United States, moving from 78% to 84%. This is per capita. So it's a race. Everyone's moving at the same time. But the most interesting thing is looking at the Baltic countries and the Eastern European countries in general, how much they caught up, okay? Because, we all think, when I first started thinking about Bulgaria, and I went to Bulgaria and Romania in 1992, it was a very different place than it is now, okay? And they're still not done. So here's 2016. The gap is closing, and Germany is also, in some sense, doing better. And in the most recent years, we see that the UK, as a consequence of Brexit, actually falls back with respect to the US, and Eastern Europe continues to close. Okay, so it's a very interesting convergence process, but it's not uniform. There can be setbacks, and if you look at Greece, you see a huge setback in 2009, 2010, and they're still recovering. We'll talk about that in the next few weeks. Okay, I'll skip this. Overall, we still have to deal with this issue that Europe may not actually be able to make regions look like the European average. So, I mean, we're kind of assuming that it is possible for Albania to adopt something that looks like the aggregate production function in France or Germany. That may not be feasible for whatever reasons. If it's because of corruption or if it's because of bad governance or ethnic strife, we can't do anything about it. But you can also just say you can't join. Right? So Bosnia would like to join. Kosovo would like to join. It's not clear that they have the conditions, the preconditions. And if they don't have the preconditions and you let them join, you're going to have a situation like this. Imagine if you have a world where you have the Edgeworth box, but you have fundamentally different productivities. So the diagonal is no longer a relevant point of efficiency. The efficient allocation is to move everybody and every unit of capital to the productive region. So if you want to think about this in terms of Berlin and Brandenburg, this means like emptying Brandenburg of people and capital and moving it to Berlin. That's the efficient solution. Now you're going to say, man, that's a crazy idea, but it is the logical consequence of these permanent efficiency differences. And you don't want to do that with a country. You don't want to have everybody and everything over here. So think about that. There are congestion costs, obviously, if you move all this stuff from Brandenburg to Berlin. And by the way, there are some nice parts of Brandenburg. Brandenburg's like a donut around Berlin, for those of you who don't know. And some parts of the donut are quite good, and some parts are pretty empty. I mean, about half of Brandenburg is a national park or a wildlife preserve. Now, and it makes sense because there are lots of, storks you want to take care of, you want to protect, but in the limit, you don't want to go all the way. So it's about TFP convergence, and I really wanted to get that on the table. Okay, so let's talk about trade now. Go back to trade, and this is the last cut we'll do on this, the last take we'll do on trade, because there's an element of trade that we haven't talked about. We've talked about, this is relevant for the exam. There are three types of trade. Ricardian is the one that we all learned about in high school, comparative advantage, right? Not absolute advantage. And we've kind of understood that if you take Ricardian trade too seriously, you should completely specialize. And we know that's not feasible either. So it's showing some of the tension between highly productive regions and less productive regions. You want to have some sort of diversification. And that's what Hector Olin would tell us, because as soon as you have capital and labor in the story, then you're going to have the ability to produce more or less of the capital-intensive or labor-intensive good. The final type of trade, which I alluded to already, was that we might be doing two-way trade. So Germany exports beer to Poland, and Poland exports beer to Germany. Why would they do that? Why would the French export beer to Germany? Or why would the Germans import or export bicycles to France? Because the French do it better. French bicycles are better. Just assert that. Maybe it's not true anymore. Okay, they were quite good at it. Why would the Germans import machine tools from France? It's not just because they're cheaper. Maybe they do something very special. Maybe they're specialized. Maybe there's product differentiation. All right, so maybe on even days of the week, I like to drink Lech beer. On odd days of the week, I drink Starnberger. Okay? Maybe I like that. Maybe it makes me happier. I don't want to have the same stuff every day. Right? So variety is the spice of life, or productivity is different. Certain types of screws, may work better for certain applications. Of course, I can always use a nail but maybe I want to use something specialized. So this type of specialization is what makes trade between countries and regions actually happen, even though they have identical factor endowments. So France and Germany have huge export flows, import flows. Fascinating. Half of German-French trade has been attributed to intra-industry trade. Intra, not inter, intra-industry trade. So how do we think about that? How do you explain that? Well, I already tried to explain it. There's maybe a preference for differentiation, but there's something else going on. Something else matters for that. What do you think? What do you need to create variety? What do you need to make your product different from the others? What would that be? What would that be? Specialized inputs. It's very sophisticated. Just think about the example I gave you. What do you need to make Starnberger Pils special? Yeah. You need to convince people like us that it's different. What do we call that? In BWL, what's it called? What do the business people call that? Marketing, right. So you have to convince people, maybe it's a big fat lie, maybe they're identical, but you need to convince people that there's a willingness for them to pay for it, and it's different. Product differentiation, marketing. Maybe it's real. I mean, I like to run in New Balance shoes. And I've been using New Balance shoes for 35 years. And this is not an ad for New Balance, because I like them. I've tried other shoes and I don't like them, right? That's just me. And it's a good brand, and if they don't work, if they fall apart, I can take them back and they'll replace them, etc. So New Balance, this company in Massachusetts, has invested years and years and years in trying to convince people, not just convince them, but actually make a product that's different. So they have to do a little bit of special sauce to make that shoe better. And that's true of a lot of products. So you had a question? Did you have a question?
I thought maybe there are actually little differences in different products, like for example.
Exactly, right. So like some of this differentiation could be natural, like, just exogenous, because, Germany passed a law in 1516, I think, said that you can only have 4 ingredients in beer, and a lot of people think that was just to protect the beer producers or prevent people from putting strange weeds in the beer. But in the end, it has made German beers kind of special. So if you go to the United States, you can see that Americans know what the Reinheitsgebot is. They can't exactly pronounce it, but I know what it is. All right, so that's this investing resources or some natural reason that resources are different. And if that's the case, you're going to have scale economies. Because to invest in a reputation, you have to spend a certain fixed amount of money, and then you create this image, whether it's true or not. It may be true. Like I said, New Balance, they've invested a lot. Microsoft Computer, why does Microsoft make computers? Well, they've got a reputation, and it's pretty reliable. And I'm willing to pay a little bit more for that as opposed to a Dell, just because I like it. And they've convinced me. So it's kind of a mixture of truth and clever marketing. Okay? But that involves scale economies, because you have to spend a certain amount of money in any case. No matter how many you sell, I got to spend a certain amount of money. Marketing. It's a fixed cost. Okay? And if there's scale economies and you have free trade, then you can expand your market. And what do we know about fixed costs? The more you sell, the lower the average cost. And if the price doesn't change, the higher your margin, because you've already paid the fixed cost, and now you can just produce lots and lots and lots. Depending on how the marginal costs are looking, you can make lots of money. Okay, so fixed costs induce what we call local scale economies. So when Lech starts to export to Germany, some Germans know about Lech because they've been to Breslau or wherever, they've seen it before, or Posen, Yeah, Poznan. And that means that this reputation, expanding the volume means an increase in profits because the fixed costs have already been paid. This means that when you open to trade, you can go into the other market. So the German companies that are engaging in Poland can sell into Poland, and they don't have to pay those fixed costs again, and the Polish companies can do the same thing. So that's the logic of imperfect competition with local scale economies. So, this hexroline doesn't capture this at all. So we have to throw hexroline out the window because we now have increasing returns. We're going to have to think hard about this. This is the case of intra-industry trade because I get to go in their market, they get to go in my market. We can expand, but maybe profitability will be threatened. So some brands may not make it. So the fact is there's a preference for variety, and there's also production variety. So again, I talked about different types of tools. The more specialized they are, the more productive they may be. These are all kind of similar ways of looking at the same thing. Okay, so if you have scale economies, free trade means I can expand my market in the other region, but I'm going to have incursion. I'm going to have to accept incursion from the other guys. So we have competition. This is competition in the case of imperfect competition, not perfect competition with a price-taking behavior. Okay, so you have this. Gains of trade look a little bit different. It's not just me getting a cheaper loaf of bread. It's about price reductions because the price of beer, on average, of all these different brands, even though I have different willingness to pay, will go down. Okay, there'll be more variety, so I don't have to drink the same beer every night. Every day of the week, I can try something different. This is why French import German wine. They kind of get tired of their own stuff, right? It's why Germans import French cars. It's incredibly interesting because it's not in our hexroline model. Hexroline model is a very homogeneous type of good. Now, the downside is that some companies will go out of business. And my colleague and co-author Charles Wiplows always told me that the downside of globalization for the French is that they have less French cheese brands. Okay, so you all know what Charles de Gaulle said. How can you have agreement in a country where there are 450 different types of cheese? The French love cheese, and they like the variety. And if a little local producer of cheese goes out of business because the Danes are exporting into France, that's going to cause some tension. And that's one reason why the French are not so crazy about globalization. Okay? So it's a little bit like survival of the fittest. Some companies will not make it. When I first came to Berlin, there was a beer brand called Poison Pilz. Does anybody remember Poison Pilz? It went out of business before you were born. It was like 1993 or something. A lot of these brands were bought up by other West German beer brands, producers. So you think you're getting an East German brand, but you're actually getting a West German brand that's brewed in East Germany. Okay? But in this case, Poison Pilz disappeared, gone. Rex Pilz in Potsdam, another brand that disappeared. So a lot of people in Potsdam probably miss old Rex Pilz. Maybe if there's enough demand, it'll come back, but it won't come back in the guise of the old company. Okay, so let's talk about these in detail. Why do we have price reductions? Obviously, I expand my market by moving into the other region. Fixed costs get amortized over larger volumes. Prices go down. I'm going to have a picture in a second to show you that. Think about your model of imperfect competition from microeconomic price setting. You got to have those fixed costs, and you've got to have fairly flat marginal costs. And that's probably a good characterization of a lot of the products that we're talking about. You also have an increase in variety. Okay, so you have more entry, you have larger markets, fixed costs don't change by definition, so basically more brands can be sustained. But if you add N and N, you may not get 2N. So if there's N brands in France and N brands in Germany, and you integrate, some will go out of business. So you'll have 2N minus something. So that's the part I was talking about, the culling of firms, the fact that the most inefficient firms will disappear. So the little goat cheese producer in Charles Wiplow's village went out of business. They just couldn't compete with the larger cheese producer down the road. Now you might say, well, so what? That's market. That's the market economy. But if you value diversity and you think this is your national identity, then it may not be so easy, right? Because the Danish make blue cheese, the French make blue cheese. And last time I was in Copenhagen a few months ago, you can actually get Roquefort, and it's there. So the Danes have accepted it. The question would be, how much Danish cheese will people buy and be willing to pay for it in France? Okay, because just allowing for free trade does not automatically mean that it's going to happen. So let's just remind ourselves the theory. The theory is really easy. If you did micro, you remember this stuff. You got a negatively sloped demand curve. The willingness to pay for any brand is not constant. Okay, so basically the idea is the seller of this particular brand, this product, is facing a negatively sloped demand curve, which means that if I raise the price, I'm going to have fewer units that are demanded, but it might be the case that my profits could be higher. It depends on how my costs look. And this is from Baldwin Wiplow's flat marginal costs. So just make it as easy as possible. So to produce an extra bottle of beer, I just have to put in a certain number of euros, and that's it. And no matter what volume I have, but I have to pay these fixed costs. So in terms of the margin, you can see that if the marginal revenue is the additional revenue I get by increasing my volume of one unit, I have two effects. One is I get more in the sale, but I also push my price down. Okay, and that marginal revenue curve is always below the marginal willingness to pay, which is the demand curve. Okay? So you optimize, you maximize profits when you set marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And you choose Q star. That's the theory. Now suddenly you have another competitor. So you thought you had a monopoly, and suddenly someone comes into the market. So what's going to happen? Well, it depends on what the other guys are doing. So if both firms are behaving symmetrically, you can think of this as kind of an increase in the elasticity of demand for your product, given what the other guys are doing, but also you'll choose a different volume. You'll choose to sell less. Okay? And in a duopoly case, these have to be consistent with each other. We can generalize this to a larger set of firms. The idea is simply the markup will decline the more competition you have. So the more firms are out there, the less you're going to be able to exploit under very robust conditions. There's a particular industrial organization concept being applied in this case, but it's a generalizable idea. The more firms, the higher the elasticity of demand, and the lower the marginal cost, marginal revenue markup that you can have. Okay? Because remember, you choose the price that sets marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and then you have a resulting profit after you subtract the fixed costs, and that's what we call the markup. Okay? There's a markup on marginal costs, and there's a markup on average costs. You can calculate both of them. European integration has an effect on that situation. So you're going to increase the elasticity of demand for your product because you're competing with the other guys, but your potential volume will go up. That is, the amount of units you can sell in the other region will go up. So it's a race between those two possibilities. So a lot of firms will benefit from open trade, and some less efficient ones will not. Okay, so here's the diagram you're going to have to learn. And Berfin is an expert on this. She did her master's degree in industrial organization. She knows this stuff cold. this is going to be basically the model that we're going to think of. And this is in the book as well. So instead of the price on the vertical axis, we have the markup. How much can I mark up over my costs? Okay? And like I said, the more competition you have, the harder it is for me to put a markup on my costs because I'm competing with all these other similar brands that may not be as good as mine, but there's certainly some price elasticity involved. And then you've got this break-even curve, which says the larger the number of firms are, the larger the markup has to be to cover the costs, because you have to cover marginal and fixed costs to stay in business. Right? If you have negative profits, you're going to exit the industry. If you have positive profits, you're going to be happy. And I'm talking about economic profits now. Okay, so the break-even curve says that the more firms I have, the higher the markup is going to have to be to sustain and pay for those fixed costs. Okay, so this is the diagram I'd like you to use to think about European integration. This is totally different. Maybe you've never seen this kind of stuff before, but it's really super interesting. And this breakdown, we're now thinking about imperfect competition. We deal with it every day. Every day we deal with, imperfectly competing firms. What is the effect of opening up Germany to the Polish market? Letting Polish people come over here, Polish firms sell their stuff here, and let German firms sell their stuff in Poland. Which one of these curves is going to shift the most, or shift at all? If you think of each firm having a very similar cost situation in terms of fixed costs and in terms of marginal costs, the BE curve will shift because you've doubled the size of the market. If Poland and Germany are the same size, opening up to trade will mean that German firms can sell in Poland and vice versa. The competition curve, the sensitivity of the markup, depending on the number of firms, won't change because you just got more firms. There are more Polish firms in Germany competing. So that curve won't shift. What will shift is the break-even curve will shift. When you integrate markets, you end up having a larger number of firms that have to be sustained at a given markup. Okay? So you can see what's going to happen. If you think about the intersection of those two curves as being the equilibrium markup and the equilibrium number of firms, the old equilibrium was in the upper left, and the new equilibrium is in the lower right. So opening up to Poland means that potentially a large number of firms could be supported, but they won't make it because the markup will go down and they won't be able to cover their costs. And therefore, what is the outcome? We move to a lower markup, prices are lower, so we should be happy as consumers, but we don't have two N firms. We have less than two N firms. So exit occurs. The French cheese producer that had too high costs or just, randomly just went out of business because you can't sustain two N firms. So that's the what we call the downside of opening up to trade in a world with imperfect competition. Okay, so that's the conundrum. You're going to have losers. I said this in the very beginning. You're going to have losers and winners in trade. Consumers will benefit globally because the prices of all the products go down. We will miss some products because they disappear. So there will be some loss of variety relative to 2N. But we'll have more variety. You'll just have to consume other regions' variety. Okay? So poison pills disappears, but as a result, I have Lech. Okay? Sorry, I would talk about beer too much, but it's just always on my mind. Okay? So let's finish by talking about foreign direct investment in conjunction with that. So one of the things that fascinates me whenever I go to Poland and look at industrial facilities is that a lot of what the Germans are investing in is output that they'll sell back into Germany. So you observe a lot of investors buying stuff that ultimately gets re-exported. So these things are not separated. FDI is part of the story. Carrefour, famous French retail outlet, one of the largest in Europe actually, was very active in Poland, very beginning. From the very beginning, they invested in lots of stores, right? FDI is part of that differentiation process. And of course, it's also having all the other effects we talked about. It increases capital intensity. It's not just about creating differentiation. So all these things are happening at the same time. It's not just factor intensities that matter. It's also the product differentiation and re-export. So, don't be surprised when German investors go into Poland and buy food production and re-export it. A great example of that I showed you at the very beginning was dairy production. So a lot of Brandenburg dairy capital moved to Poland, and those dairy products are being re-exported to Germany. That would only have been possible with the EU. So your milk is cheaper. If you drink milk, it's cheaper as a result. Okay, so I'm about to finish now. I'm going to talk about the final summary. TFP differences. We talked about this already. Think of TFP as not just technology. It's not just, it's the height of the production function. How much can we produce with labor and capital? But it's not just because of technology. You can have similar technology available, but for some reason, the economy just doesn't cut it. Okay, so maybe workers are less well educated because we don't have education in this production function. It's just K and L. It could also be because there's not enough roads and infrastructure. There's not enough hospitals so people can stay healthy. All these things can affect productivity. It can also be corruption. I've mentioned that a lot, right? If you're in a country where you're ruled by a bunch of gangsters, it's going to be very difficult for you to do business there. It's going to be very difficult for you to attain the same level of productivity as other regions. So all this means that you have a barrier to integration. So Europe has this problem, but it has other problems as well. Okay, European integration has taken a long time. So it tells me that even with trade integration, even with mobility, there are certain things that are preventing convergence of some regions. And I think of southern Italy, for example. Okay, I think of parts of Germany, right? And every country is willing to support with their tax revenues certain regions, even though they're never going to make it, right? So this is part of the formula for a country, but what happens when you move to a region, from a region to Europe? Now, how much obligation does Europe have to take care of parts of Greece that have never developed? There are parts of Romania that will take another 5 decades to develop, probably. It's going to take a long time. And the Mezzogiorno has been around for many, many decades. Some people say that parts of East Germany will not make it in terms of, can Europe actually sustain that type of outcome? How much willingness to pay is there in Germany to pay for developing areas of Bulgaria? Or how much willingness of Bulgaria is there to pay for parts of Germany? Right? So this is a question about solidarity. Where does this stop? So you've got this, you've got this tribalness of Europe, which you don't have in other countries. You don't have it in China. You don't have it in the United States. And you can say you have something like that, but it's not the same, right? There's a certain amount of common identity. People still don't identify as Europeans. This is always going to be a problem. And yet we know, and this is the last point, externalities are important. So what are externalities? By the way, I had a fantastic meeting yesterday with Kukis. He's the Kanzlerberater. I can say this freely. Fascinating economic analysis. Like he took all the economics course. He was talking about externalities. He was talking about public goods. He was talking about competition policy, It's fascinating. So the Bundeskanzler is getting advised by a really, really smart guy. So what's an externality? And why are externalities important for Europe? Again, that's something we learn in economics. The market does not always solve everything, right? Unless you figure out a way to establish property rights for an externality. Yeah.
Basically, the impact of some kind of interaction between two agents and a third agent is not regulated by a process.
Right. It's outside the market. Right? So if I put a big solar panel on my roof and it reflects light into your window and you live next door in your apartment, you know, I should actually pay you because I'm blinding you every time you look out the window. You got the solar panel reflecting. I'm doing something good, but at the same time, I'm creating this negative effect on you. So there's no market for that. You know, I could come over and ask you, can I pay you to tilt your solar panel? And you say, no, I'm maximizing my electricity production. And there's so many examples of like that. Think about the wind power parks and that are being refused by the Bavarians because they don't want to soil their beautiful countryside. But the northern Europeans, the northern Germans are doing it, you know. Beautiful Mecklenburg-Vorpommern is turning into this big wind park. These are externalities. But also, having a border policy involves externalities. Okay, if I push people back, I push them into other neighboring country, that's kind of an externality. Germany doesn't have to deal with the Turkish migration problem. So it's easy to say whatever you want, right? Environmental regulation. If the French put nuclear power plants on the German border, they're a good right to do that, isn't it? Creates a lot of externalities. There's all sorts of other, so every country dealing in this trading union, customs union, exerts a little externality on the others. And Europe is about trying to conquer those externalities, try to harness them, right? Have a common energy policy. Figure out a way to have a common electricity grid. Instead of Germany just doing its own thing, why don't you coordinate? And by coordination, you can actually achieve a more efficient outcome. That's not in a production function we've talked about. It's really about externalities. My action affects your productivity, your well-being. So that's what Europe is really about. On the trade side, on the migration side, on the capital mobility side, all these little countries interacting with each other, you got to put the national identity aside. If you don't do that, you're going to pay a pretty high price in the future. So think about what happened with Brexit. Okay, this is going to require some imagination. I don't know if you probably don't remember Brexit, but I certainly did. I was teaching this course when it happened. It happened about this time in 2015, okay, the vote, or 2016. The British were very mad because Chancellor Merkel said, let them in. And a lot of them didn't go to Germany. A lot of them went to the UK. And that's an externality. You know, no one asked the UK. They didn't have a conference how to deal with this crisis. And I have no problem with migration, but I think every country's migration policies has external effects on the others. And if you feel like you've been ignored and your concerns have not been taken seriously, then of course you're going to get upset. So I'm not saying that Brexit was a terrible idea for the UK, but it was provoked by external effects of policies on the continent, especially in Germany. Okay? So these are things that you really need to have a governance structure, and you have to figure out some way to prevent this from getting out of hand. This applies to other things as well. Tax policies. We talked about Ireland already. Ireland, for a long time they had really low tax rates, and they got lots of American FDI and lots of German FDI and UK FDI, and were able to develop their country almost in an exploitative state. But I mean, you can praise it because it was economic growth, but you could also criticize it. Should we somehow regulate that behavior? Is that a good thing? Well, now Ireland has moved back into line with the other countries, but we need to do better at figuring out the challenges. challenges of regulation of products. You know, what good does it do for Germany to control plastic production if the rest of Europe doesn't do it? Right? This is it's absurd that, you know, it makes so much sense to have glass bottles, recyclable glass bottles. When I was growing up, we had them. Milk came in glass bottles, right? Now everything's throwaway, okay? But if Germany adopts that policy without coordinating with the others, it's not going to help, especially with open borders. Same thing is true for aluminum cans of beer. Same thing, right? And so you're going to have the cost of standardization. So this is about labor law, consumer law, environmental protection law, climate change, global warming, and public health. I wrote that just in response to the pandemic, because every country's individual pandemic policy has externalities, right? Especially if you have open borders. Protecting public health is a huge externality, and thank goodness Europe was able to figure that out. Okay, so I'm basically trying to summarize the most important issues. Will Europe ever become like the United States? I mean, is that something you want? I don't know, what do you think? So you talk to most Europeans, they like their identity. It's their language, their history, culture. America's like a melting pot. It's not an accident that they call it that, because you can move anywhere and do anything. And so the European immobility that we seem to treasure and willing to pay for doesn't exist in the United States. So again, something you have to think about. Right. Okay, so flammende Rede. This is the end of the microeconomic part of the course. So next week we start talking about macro, because there's obviously a level difference between the two. We like to think that macroeconomics is just applied microeconomics, and maybe in some level it is, but you have to take shortcuts, and that's what we'll be doing starting next week. Okay, so these are the concepts you want to remember for next time. There are a lot of them. And please go to the section this week with Berfin, because she'll talk about this BE comp model in detail. All right? Okay, so have a great week. See you.